Aloha and welcome everyone to our second caucus meeting this year. Thanks so much for dedicating your time and for many of you your evenings to this. These caucuses are part of a series of conversations that ACSA has hosted over the past year to address shifts across architectural education, accreditation, licensure, and practice, and now a shift in the political landscape with significant impacts to higher education and our organization. These changes require us to rethink our membership model and structure and focus on providing value to our members. And we're talking now really about a new iteration of ACSA. I do want to welcome and thank Liz O'Connor and Josh Moulton from Strategy Matters for leading us through our strategic planning process and for facilitating our meeting today as one of many touch points with all of you. Kind of going backwards, in November of 2024, Liz and Josh hosted a workshop at the Administrators Conference in Denver that focused on the long view for architectural education and asked attendees there where we want to be, what we want to be, and where we want to be in 25 years. And then shortly after, on November 19th, 2024, Liz and Josh facilitated a virtual town hall structured discussion soliciting feedback on ACSA's ability to effectively advocate for a field with diverse views on what belongs in architectural education. More recently, on February 27th, last week, we hosted a caucus meeting on competencies and the curriculum, and that was to look at NCARB's new competency framework. The meeting focused on ways that architectural education might integrate the development and assessment of those competencies in our own programs. So as you can see, all of these meetings focused on the shifting landscape for architectural education. And now after January 20th, that landscape has shifted again, requiring us to re-engage our members and rethink how we continue to support our values and goals in an environment hostile to higher education and hostile to many of our values and goals. So we really deeply appreciate your thoughts on how we as an organization remain a viable and vital support network to our large member group in this complex and constantly changing context. There's a lot at stake, and we appreciate your guidance as we navigate our way forward. And with that, I'd like to turn this meeting over to Liz and Josh from Strategy Matters.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kathy. It's so great to be here. And we have an agenda for you. We'll go through in a minute, but we also know that these opportunities are pretty priceless in terms of getting to know a little bit about some of your colleagues. So we're actually just going to take 3 minutes to do something quick, which is ask you to get into a small three or four person room, introduce yourselves, and share your answers to a specific question, which is going to set us into the conversation tonight. Which is, if you were in your faculty lounge today, remember those old days when you had such a thing and people actually went there? If you were in the faculty lounge today, what would you be talking about with your colleagues at your home institution? So I'm actually going to just send you randomly to a small group for just 3 minutes. Please introduce yourselves, answer that question, and when you come back, put your answers in the chat. All right. So as I say, 3 minutes, and we'll see you right back. I'd love to ask you to put some of the topics that came up into the chat so that we can see what you all talked about and what we missed. I would have loved to have heard from everyone myself. So if you don't mind, just start typing what came out of your conversation into the chat. And as you do that, I'm going to tell you what we're hoping to do with you tonight. We are really seeking to convene this group to figure out what's going on in your work, which is changing, and what's going on in your field, which is changing. And, you know, this is presumably what you're going to be talking about at your faculty lounge, or maybe your kids and their graduate school educations, which is also incredibly interesting and important. And I'm glad to hear you sharing that kind of thing as well. But we want to talk about what are some of the big challenges and worries facing the field right now and facing you as members of that field. Ultimately, of course, to inform how the association can serve you as a field and as faculty in that field. We want to hear what you're doing and what you're in need of in order to support your efforts to address the challenges that are in front of you right now, or perhaps in a more optimistic framing to seize some of the opportunities that you may find in this moment of change. And change really, it's maybe an occupational hazard that as a strategic planner, I see moments of great change and even chaos as as likely to be opportunities as they are problems. And so we're hoping to elicit some of your thoughts on that as well. We want to spend some time tonight to share with you an emerging focus from the strategic planning process and talk about some strategic areas that we hope the association will be moving toward and making some investments in, get your response and reaction to that, and hear generally what your comments and suggestions are about the association's role in your current work, in your future career, and in the future of the field. That sound about right to everyone? Came to the right meeting? Thanks. Good. That's it. So to summarize where we think we're finding you and ourselves in this moment, there are some issues that have been central to the association's agenda that are now facing real challenges. So for example, and these are, this is a handful of challenges. The rest of them are scrolling through in the chat that you can look at, of course, but that access to higher education is increasingly difficult for many students. And because much of that is a cost issue, and because of the way that wealth inequality and income inequality factors into our American population, it's increasingly difficult to keep racial and ethnic diversity in your programs. And of course, the February 14th Dear Colleague letter from the US Department of Education has most institutions of higher education figuring out how to react to that. And that's likely to have additional changes, which will affect the enrollment patterns and the race of the enrollments in your programs. Policy and funding constraints on co-curricular programs are challenging, and the restrictions on DEI at the state level has been an issue that's been in your conversations for quite some time as well. And inclusion of content itself as part of your architectural education around these issues of justice and inclusion and equity are likely to be under review if they're not already, and maybe challenging some work that you've all put in the past, I don't know how many years, decades in many cases. So those are some of the top challenges of this moment. And we really want to use this time with you to talk about how you're navigating them. And even more importantly, perhaps for our purposes as your strategic planning partners, how you think the association could best support you in navigating these issues. And again, I don't necessarily mean, although clearly for many of you, the navigation is, it will be in a form of protest or withstanding threat, but there also may be opportunities in here that we want to help you identify and talk about with some of your colleagues. So let me just pause there and see if you have any feedback on what the conversation we're trying to convene, or thoughts that you want to share at this juncture. And if you do, just unmute yourself and jump in. All right. Hopefully we're going to have a different, a different level of engagement, I suppose is the word, for the small groups that we're about to ask you to join. Again, different small group. We're going to ask you to address these two questions. I said, how are you addressing these issues and others? And, feel free to share other issues and how you think the association could best support you. And so we're going to create a series of breakout rooms. We'll give you 15 minutes. And again, we'll ask you to take notes. This time I'm going to ask you to take notes that you're able to cut and paste into the chat, because we can't send the recording everywhere. And we'd really like to capture what you talk about. So if it's a 15-minute breakout, you should have a reasonable amount of time to talk through these questions, and we'll send them out through the broadcast so you don't have to worry about copying them off of a slide. So I'm going to send you back to the small groups for 15 minutes, and we will see you when you come back. Thanks. I am hopeful that conversation was useful to you, and even maybe, dare I say, even more hopeful that it will be useful to us. We'd love to have you post in the chat what you came up with. We'd also really like to hear a couple of highlights from some of you, just to get a sense of what you discussed and what came of it. Anybody willing to share a little bit of the conversation that you just had? Great, Luis, jump in. Oh, you're muted. Hold on, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yes, okay, now I If I can summarize it, I think we talked about the wealth of knowledge and experiences that exist in the organization and how much we need about forums to exchange those experiences, the idea of how we're going to comply with the new frameworks, particularly, state institutions, but also private, how they're going to comply at a time where research funds may actually be compromised. We need some exchange of best practices in managing what potentially is going to be a more polarized classroom, would involve students on both sides. Potentially also that will happen in our faculty meetings, and how to manage those situations, is important. And this is the group where we can actually share, those experiences and learn from each other how to manage those, which potentially will be more difficult situations coming to all of our environments. I think that was one of the components of our conversation.
That's interesting. Yeah, just sort of I hadn't thought about the concept of best practices in navigating this, but that's probably a really useful thing. And did you identify any that you wanted to share, or is it too early?
I don't think we identified any, but the important thing is, that there is a huge legal framework, and actually trying to understand that legal framework for us that are not, we're not lawyers, we're not attorneys. So getting some advice or share what we're hearing in our campus, or getting some central advice, I think will be useful. And personally, what I put in the chat before we break out, I think in my mantra right now is, reframe, do not refrain. The populations that needed our help, and the environment are exactly the same than in January 19. Policies are different, and we need to figure out how to navigate the environment, because our work is still very, very much needed. So.
Super, thank you. Others, either reactions or additional comments about what you shared in your groups?
Liz, I'll jump in.
Yeah, thank you.
One of the things that we shared, and it was Daniel and from Lawrence Tech, and Moselle from Wisconsin, and myself, the conversation around workload that faculty are facing at different schools, whether there are one or two, sometimes there's a variable workload there, but I get the sense that across, and I'd love to hear from everyone on the screen, faculty are feeling increasingly like they're being asked to do more, often with less. And so it's both teaching more, larger class sizes, and recruitment efforts, growth to maintain visibility on campuses, but also at the same time, somehow balancing that with an increased research load. And at a certain point, you just don't have the extra 24 hours in the day to take on the tasks. So I think that that's something that, with all of the stuff that's swirling around right now, is increasing the anxiety around what it means to be an academic, what it means to be someone in architecture who is in an academic environment where traditional models, for example, if I can call them that, of research, always felt like a poor fit to begin with. So anyway, I thought, it's just raising more anxiety. So on top of the things that Luis is describing, the positive outlook of trying to reframe is hard to hear, I think, on some faculty's side right now, because they're just so inundated with just trying to meet their workload demands.
Yeah, I noticed too a lot in the opening question, a lot about faculty search. It seems perhaps many of the programs are understaffed. And, maybe there's some vacancies to worry about. Is that how that's working? Is that interacting with that issue of overwork?
Partially it is doing that, but in our case, it's because we've had actually quite a few retirements in the same year. So which we had, some were expected, some were sudden. So which meant we had to redouble efforts to hire more people. Yeah.
Other thoughts and observations either about the challenges in front of you or how the association might make itself helpful in meeting them?
I have two. Very quick. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
We need that joint voice. There's a times are coming where we're going to be asked to to justify a return of investment. You know, I think there is a higher education is being reframed from that perspective, you know, and work that ACSA is already doing in collecting data, you know, and maybe we'll need more data actually to make that particular case. So I think that is going to be very important. And what I said at the beginning, faculty, the venues for presentation, dissemination of scholarly work are probably going to become more complicated. So we need to really continue the work in that area.
Yeah. That makes sense. Thank you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, who's going to talk a little bit about where we think the association is going. And then after Josh has outlined that a little bit, we're going to ask you to reconsider how you can envision the association being helpful to you with respect to the strategy that we're exploring. And so your feedback is part of that exploration.
Great.
Go
Thanks, Liz.
ahead, Josh. Yeah.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Certainly some familiar faces here. I think I've seen a good number of you in various venues along the way. I think as most of you know, and as Liz mentioned earlier, we're working through the strategic planning process right now with ACSA. And we're bridging this phase where we're collecting and analyzing information to where we need to get to, setting goals and developing strategies to achieve them. What we're trying to do right now is focus on some observations and see what kind of meaning we can make of them and see what kind of indications, what direction they're pointing us in terms of goals and strategy. The board will be convening for a session to set goals. It won't be us, doing this off in a laboratory somewhere. This will be you all doing it with our support with facilitation. But what we're trying to do is cue up the conversation in the right way. And so we want to share a couple of observations with you and, sort of talk a little bit about where we see the strategy heading. And then, as Liz mentioned, get some feedback on that. So I think one of the first observations that seems pretty important to us that we've kind of been struggling with, I guess, since the very beginning of the project is the fact that on the one hand, ACSA would like to or has been positioning itself as the voice of architectural education. And so we thought, okay, that seems like a great, strong stance for an association of architectural educators to take on. So what does that mean? And so I think one of the things that we have been contending with is the fact that there really isn't, at least so far as we've been able to discern, a single clear agreed upon conception of what architectural education is. Now, that's not a criticism, it's just an observation. And I think that together with some other things makes some of what we're trying to sort through a little bit challenging here. So Liz, if we could go forward to the next slide, I wanted to share some words from all of you that we got from a recent member survey. So we had this question in the member survey: what do you think the voice of architectural education is saying right now? And here I think is a representative sampling of some of the things that people had to say. The first was architectural education right now is in panic about the state of higher education, about artificial intelligence, about what the canon means today at teaching to a broader constituency who's more poorly prepared in terms of knowledge and fundamental abilities, ranging from how to draw to how to write a paragraph. Architectural education is expressing a confused desire for social engagement, absent tangible means of articulating this engagement in the material form of architecture. It's in transition from the extensive theory-based curriculum towards a broader curriculum that includes engaging in practice, social awareness, and the multiplicity of potential roles. And then finally, it's trying to say too many things all at the same time, right? So these are, your words collectively as an association. And again, I think this is pretty representative of the 400 plus responses to the survey that we were looking through. So again, what we're seeing here is a field. I really like this third one, this idea of kind of transitioning in this transitioning process, trying to reimagine, re-understand what it means to be engaged in architecture in particular as a discipline and how it relates to practice. So what does that all mean? So on the one hand, it seems like there's great heterogeneity when it comes to what architectural education means according to many members of ACSA, right? A lot of different conceptions in circulation. Fine, okay, that's good. There's lots of associations out there that have to, be a big tent for lots of different perspectives. The American Medical Association has to be, representative for hundreds of different specialties and different states and so on. So it's not representing a multiplicity of perspectives is nothing, especially challenging in and of itself. However, I think given the fact that you have this heterogeneity along with just an amazing array of potential existential threats, that I think is a situation that together those two things create a pretty significant challenge, right? So as we know, there are lots of threats out there coming from a lot of different directions. One way that we've been thinking about this recently is, pick some way, your favorite way of articulating what is core or fundamental to architectural education today, right? There's probably going to be, at least in this group here, I would imagine a handful of answers, probably not one per person, but more than two, I would guess. But for each of those different conceptions, there's probably a unique threat that goes along with it, at least one and probably many. There's threats to higher education in general. As we know, if you think of issues of social, spatial, environmental justice as being core concepts of architectural education, well, that is under attack right now politically and in some sectors and in some domains socially as well. If you think of architectural education as being fundamentally aimed at preparing somebody for a career in the practice of architecture, well, a lot of the things that you might be needing to learn and be able to do entering a career as an architect might be vulnerable to automation of various sorts. AI might be there ready to step in and take a lot of those jobs, depending on how you think of the skills and competencies that go along with it. And then finally, if you think somewhat more philosophically and abstractly maybe about architectural education as being fundamentally concerned with critical thinking, with design thinking and methods, then there's a lot of pressure on you. I think, Luis, as you were mentioning a moment ago, this particular kind of liberal arts heavy conception is probably the one where you're going to be threatened by this need to demonstrate the ROI on a really, a potentially very expensive education. So, you pick your conception and you're gonna find a couple threats to it at least. So I think in that melee, it's sort of, Liz, I think we can skip to the next slide. So on the one hand, we have this heterogeneity, many different voices, many different conceptions of what architectural education is. And at the same time, apparently existential threats to kind of pick your favorite conception, there's going to be threats to it. So given that, and given the fact, I think also that it would be reasonable to assume that if you're feeling threatened, you're going to be kind of disposed to adopting a defensive posture, right? You're going to be probably especially kind of entrenched in some ways in your way of seeing things and especially prone to wanting to defend, what has been your domain for a long time. How is an association supposed to be the voice given that range of considerations, the heterogeneity plus the proliferation of different threats? So in thinking through this, we thought, well, there's at least three things that this could mean, probably a lot more, but at least three things come to mind quickly in terms of a kind of a strategic orientation for an association like ACSA, which needs to be represent and serve its members that are in the situation that I just described of being one kind of heterogeneous with respect to conceptions of what architectural education is and experiencing lots of threats. So what are the three things? So on the one hand, you might try to be all things to all people, be all things to all members. Try to figure out where all the threats are, try to figure out how to respond to those threats, and then just go out and do that. That's one option. Probably would take an organization at least 100 times the size to pull off something like that effectively, given the range of issues that are going on out there. The next choice would be something like pick the winners, right? Like pick a couple of different conceptions of architectural education that you're particularly attracted to, or identify one or two main threats and focus on those, and then kind of see where the cards land, a couple years down the road. And then, the next thing would be to think, and I think, for what it's worth, I think those first two options I just described, I think that it's possible that the last strategic plan kind of set up a course that was kind of a combination of those first two in some ways. Maybe I could be talked out of that, but that's just a kind of off the cuff observation when I was looking through that plan really recently. The last option, I think, would be to adopt a posture of being a convener and an advocate for some general sorts of things. And really investing, it's almost like one way to do Big Tent as an association would be to figure out what's really interesting to all the people under your tent, and then make offerings, that are aligned to all of those various interests. Another way to do Big Tent is to invest in the tent. And I think that's sort of what we're suggesting here with the third one, is like figure out how to create a space and facilitate dialogue across a lot of differences, there's a lot of differences. So within what architectural education is, could be, should be, across the political spectrum, across this orientation between, the traditional canon, more philosophical aspects of architectural education and the more practical and applied aspects of it. And then figure out, within this group, across all of this diversity, what are the shared goals? And then how do we advocate effectively for those shared goals once we've figured out, what they are, which ones rise to the top? And so what we had been thinking is there's actually a pretty good framework that's in circulation that could be leveraged on behalf of that final option. And it's called the Strong Field Framework. This is what we've put together here is kind of how would we put it? This is an adaptation of a framework that's been in circulation. So it has several features to it. And if you're worried about how long I've been talking, I've got maybe 2 more minutes, and then we can move back to the part where you all are talking. So this framework has 6 features. The first one, and let me just say actually first that here when we're talking about a field, what we mean is a community of organizations and individuals that are working together to achieve some kind of common goal using not necessarily the same, but complementary strategies. Complementary in the sense that they're not, directly antagonistic to one another. Okay, so the idea here is that a strong field is a field that has these features to it. One, shared identity. Right? So there's clarity and agreement about the purpose of and membership in the field. You know what you're there to do together. Second, there are standards of practice, right? So there's well-defined and well-understood account of what it takes to do the work well. So you could say, for X or Y member of the field, you could look at the way that they're participating in the field and evaluate it with respect to some standards of practice. The third is that you have some knowledge base, right? So bodies of research that support those standards of practice. So standards of practice, tell you what it takes to do the job well, and the knowledge base is just some research data that substantiates what you're saying with your standards of practice. The next is to have engaged participants. So you have influential leaders, you have various constituencies, you have members practicing in the field that are active and engaged in field-related activities. Fifth, there's some funding and supporting policy, right? So there may be potentially some legislation or some policies within various institutions connected to the field that support what the field is doing, and some funding that's there also to support it. And then finally, and I think this one's actually pretty important, and one that I think a point that we thought was pretty important to add to the other 5 was that there's catalysts for emergence. So what that means is that it's kind of built into this field that it has the capacity to kind of introspect and renew and reinvent itself in response to changing circumstances in the world around it, or perhaps in response to revolutions within it as well. So those are the 6 features that we think are really important. And when we looked, we've done some analysis on what's going well, what are some challenges, what are opportunities, what are threats facing the association right now. And I think that a lot of those can be viewed through this lens of, there are opportunities to improve with respect to the clarity of your shared identity, the clarity of standards of practice. But I think one of the things that we do see is that there's a lot of energy around this 6th thing. There are catalysts for emergence here within this field. So I think our thinking now is that something like this framework might be something that you could really lean on as an association in order to support this transitional moment for architectural education, and not kind of demand that it fit with this conception or with that conception, but rather give it the space to evolve, and see where you end up in a little bit of time. Liz, what would you add to that?
I would just add that a lot of the things that are vexing many kinds of institutions in our society right now could be, I think, in a way, I don't mean avoided in the sense that you're avoiding difficult conversations, but you can get other things done in a strong field without developing a specific point of view on any particular issue. So I've been thinking a lot about journalism because of this recent news that the Washington Post is going to eliminate opinion pieces that disagree, that are not focused on the benefits of free markets and individual liberties. That's a really significant change in the field of journalism. I think it's showing some fractures. That field has been struggling to stay a strong field for a long time. And technology, not incidentally, has been an enormous part of what threatened it. So I think there's some parallels and some interesting lessons, I hope, that we can draw from where journalism has gone right or wrong in terms of its strength, not in terms of what it does or doesn't do properly or the point of view it maintains, but just as a field, how is it holding up? And I think if we think about those parallels here, the issue isn't that ACSA, in our view, we're sort of recommending this at this stage, that ACSA pick a point of view and say, this is our architectural education and nothing else is, and we won't sort of engage with people who think otherwise, but rather we want to be a strong field. We want to be behind the idea of a growing, changing, diverse field that has a tent that is capacious enough to hold diverse opinions and disagreements and be a catalyst for change that retains diversity. And of course, there are some boundaries. There will be things that are not in that field. A shared identity clearly means we know who is and who isn't in it. So I don't mean to suggest that it means that there are no points of view whatsoever, but the points of view tend to be about what belongs in the conversation, not what point of view I have in that conversation. Does that make sense as a distinction for you? Yeah, jump in, just come on into the conversation as you see fit. Oh, Luis, you're muted still.
I have a question. For better or worse, our field is divided. There are 5 organizations, probably clustered around 3 groups. ACSA represents the faculty and the discipline, so we create and disseminate knowledge around the discipline of architecture. Then NCARV and AIA represent the people that apply that knowledge in the profession. And you remember from our time in Denver that I make a distinction between the discipline and the profession. Discipline, the all-encompassing, and the profession, bounded by traditions, contracts, economics, legalities, all those different things. And then you have the connection between the two, that is AIAS, the students that are sort of that fluid that, keeps all of these groups together. So when you talk about the discipline, and what we're doing, how does this account for these other groups? Because we're in charge of one part, not all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that I think there's probably a lot of answers to that, and actually better for you all to answer it than me. But I think there's room in the idea of the field for multiple components, as it were. And I think that it might mean that the field is bigger. ACSA doesn't represent the full field, but rather a fraction of it, but an important, leg of the 3-legged stool. Is that?
Well, but for me, I mean, it's how do we define the field? If the field is the discipline, is the creation and dissemination of knowledge.
I see.
I actually see it that way. I'm actually not sure if I want to make it all, or we can make it all encompassing, at least in the context where we live right now. And I may be wrong. I'll be happy to be wrong.
I think there's probably some reasonable people could disagree on how to proceed on that question. I think it's really one of the very interesting questions ahead. Kathy, did you have a thought about that? I just saw you thinking about it. Okay.
Then Liz,
I-
Timothy has a hand up too.
Oh, sure. Timothy, please jump in. Sorry, I
Oh,
didn't see
fine.
that.
No, it's good. This discussion reminds me of something in another context altogether. And I'll admit, I have not been completely tuned into these kinds of distinctions, but I had the opportunity to collaborate with Interfaith Youth Corps that then became Interfaith America through some of my research into religious architecture and things like that. But yeah, they have been advocating the idea that interreligious studies is an emerging field. And I contributed a small bit to an essay subtitled "Dispatches from the Field." It's kind of like from, how might this start to be taking shape? And the editor, I recall, made a really strong distinction between a discipline and a field. And his point is there are disciplines, and they have harder boundaries. They have clearer senses of what counts as contributions to knowledge, et cetera. But fields are by definition looser. And I'm not sure that I have an opinion on what's been presented, although I find in a moment of uncertainty and transition a value, and it's appealing to me to think of architectural education as a field, because we can disagree about what constitutes the role of and process for education. But certainly, if we step back further and say, what is architecture? I mean, people have been disagreeing about that forever, and what are the boundaries of that? And in terms of the different organizations, I have often just thought of it as the profession is a profession, but there's an identity there that's different than an academic discipline or field.
Right.
And then, an NCARB is a matter of legislative matters. And then obviously NAB is the accrediting body. And those are in some weird way almost different in their own sense. I can imagine each five having distinct senses of identity that all together try to improve the role in its broadest sense of architecture in the built environment in society. But I'm intrigued, and I think I really like the idea of ACSA embracing a field self-identity rather than a discipline, because in my understanding of it, only as encountering it through this interreligious studies thing, is that there is an embrace of a greater fluidity if you claim of it being a field and not a discipline.
I think that's very helpful. Both of those comments, I think, advanced this conversation in just the way we'd hoped. Thank you. Other thoughts from anyone here before we move on? Thank you. That's
Daniel
Yeah, go
had
ahead.
a comment in the chat, I mean, also, the discipline cannot be all encompassing, what I mean? So, and I will agree with that. I'm not sure if he wanted to talk more about it, so.
Yeah, we want you to talk more about it, actually. And this time may feel long to you. It feels very short to us. So we want to get you again into your last small group of the evening. And we're going to ask you to think about together 3 questions. Let's see, I can change it here. Here are the 3 questions. You've been discussing one. What questions do you have about our emerging strategy focusing on field building? So how is a field different than a discipline would be a question. Which one should we be representing, and what does that mean? What could this strategy offer you that helps you meet this moment? How does this concept of investing in your tent help you navigate the very real and very concrete challenges about real points of view that are in conflict in your universities and colleges? And so I think there's as much as I'm a fan of this strategy and we're recommending it, I think there certainly are limitations that are going to be obvious to you when you think, no, it's really important that we take a particular stand. What else is there to be said about what this offers and what it leaves aside? And how do you think about that? And how do you want the association to think about some of that? And last, what kind of value might a reorientation towards the investment in the tent of field building bring for you, your colleagues, and other current or prospective members? So we're going to, again, ask you to go to a breakout group. Before I send you, let me just see if that's a clear set of instructions. And if you have any questions about the, the task, I guess, in front of you. Any questions or concerns about that? Okay, hearing none. I'm going to recreate these, and I think it's 8:05. I think we're going to bring you back in 20 minutes just for a real quick debrief and closing. So thank you. We'll be in the main room if you have questions or concerns, and we'll broadcast these questions back for you. And again, ask you to take some notes that you can cut and paste back into the chat. That's the best way for us to capture what you've done. So thank you, and have a productive conversation out there for the next 20 minutes. What you said. So who wants to unmute themselves and just start talking to us a little bit?
I'll go ahead. It's already
Thank you.
unmuted.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'll go ahead and just say I was about to type, but why not? One thing we started to say is that the idea of a field is really appealing, but then depending on where you are institutionally, it may have consequences that you got to kind of navigate. What's counting as research or not? How much another kind of interpretation will prevail, or what pressures might exist in the institution. But generally, there was an embrace of, yeah, it makes sense. The field is going to be more fruitful, more flexible, all of that.
That's interesting. Great. Good. There's something else that came out of another one of the conversations. I see someone is volunteering June to share with great ideas.
I was also
Well, I
gonna
was starting
volunteer
to
before you
type,
go.
but I guess I had ideas about thinking about the convening in the way of being more intentionally inviting or supportive of maybe affinity groups, sub-affinity groups within the ACSA world, whether it's people interested in urban design or who identify as historians, or really specialists about pedagogy, and whether it's subcommittees or just just this idea of being more intentional about being an umbrella and what that might look like. And it could also be like having some shared events with Acadia or some of these other groups that have in some ways spun off.
Yeah.
So that was the idea.
That's great. Thank you. That is a great idea. Any others that you want to share out loud? Well, hopefully you're putting them all in the chat, so we don't lose any of them for posterity. But if you'd like to say them too, I'm sure your colleagues would appreciate it.
I was going to volunteer Louise before he went to dinner, because he's always so animated about these discussion points. I think we talked about kind of the tent, who's under the tent. Are they actually members, or are they just friends that we're including, and why? Then there was also conversations about, when you're thinking about yourself and your strong field, do you look at other organizations that represent a strong organization and try to emulate that, or do you take a different approach? And then I'm going to pass it to Daniel Faro, who had some ideas about maybe how we continue this discussion with others, if he's still on. Yep.
Yeah, he is. Join in, Daniel, please.
I think my comment was, if you take the points 1 through 6 and circulate it as an email to everyone in ACSA and say, what are some of your thoughts on pros and cons of 1 through 6, and what do you think of them?
I like it.
Maybe you could get some feedback.
All right, good. I think that probably was a great issue for consideration, the staff level. Others? And one final share out, if you don't mind. Love to hear one more thought, something else that we haven't heard from yet. All right, we're going to hope it all comes through in the chat. With that, let me hand it back to Josh, who will talk a little bit about what comes next.
Sure, yeah, just super briefly. So we have, as I mentioned, we're entering kind of a new phase of the planning process where now we're looking at setting goals and developing strategies and, you know, ways to track progress over time. And hope to emerge from the March meeting in New Orleans. We'll have a session with the board while we'll do some of that goal setting work and hope to emerge from that with a new set of draft goals, at least to guide the organization for the coming years. There'll be some more steps after that, you know, figuring out how to get everything polished and an implementation plan set up. Kathy, you had mentioned to me, you know, we started off the meeting talking about a range of issues that may be really impacting your programs and institutions. Some of the implications for some of you may be really challenging things to navigate. Kathy, you had mentioned to me earlier that ACSA was looking at putting together an ad hoc working group to look a little bit more closely at some of the impacts to schools related to some of the state and federal laws and orders that are coming out. So I think that's something that is going to be coming together in the coming weeks or months, and that in the interim, you know, if people have specific things that they want to talk about related to some of those challenges we were discussing earlier, maybe reaching out directly to, you know, to Mike or Kathy might be the way to start that conversation. Kathy, Mike, did I get that right? Okay. All right, great. I think that's it. Just appreciate your time again. You know, every time we get together with you all, we learn something new and enjoy the time that we have. So thank you for that. And for keeping you from dinner, hopefully you can go and have your dinner now.
Wait, we want to thank you. We want to thank you, Liz and Josh. Every time you return to us and reflect, we always move this ball forward. This particular strategic planning process is hitting at a pivotal moment. So thank you so much. I also want to thank our staff, our ACSA staff, right? All of this is weighing on some strong and mighty shoulders. So Danielle Dent, Kendall Nicholson, Eric Wayne Ellis, and Mike Monty, thank you so much for all that you do for all of us, for staying up for this past dinner time. For those of you who are still on, we do have a virtual annual business meeting coming up on Wednesday, March 5th at 7 to 8 p.m. That's also going to invite more conversation about some of the issues that we touched upon tonight. And for those of you who can join us, we have our annual meeting March 20th through 22nd in New Orleans. So we hope to see you then. Thanks everyone for your time and attention, and good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.